All right, so far I have scaled my creature. I have found the composition I like of the landscape and the creature, where the creature takes up at least 25%. I have placed my creature, and now I am using Puppet Warp to pose my creature. So it was an unfortunate place for the video to end, because I had just set my pins, but I hadn't hit return yet, right? And by setting these pins, I can decide on the pose of the creature as well, as long as the pins line up with the anatomy. Now, just because they line up with the anatomy, if I push them too far, it's not going to look good, right? It's going to look like wet macaroni. So you can always hit Command Z to undo. And I always do this on a duplicate layer. So remember, I have the hero asset, which I have not puppet warped. I duplicated it, and I puppet warped the copy. All right. Now I'm going to fine tune the ankle and really make that foot sitting in the ground. There we go. All right. So now I hit return and I've placed it. And I'm paying attention to quite a few things, like where it's overlapping. I want it in front of this tree just barely, so it's in front there, it's in front there. I want it behind this rock, which I did with an internal composite, just copying that rock in front of it. Now, I'm going to mark this blue because this is the one I'm kind of committing to for the moment. I am going to try to make this match its setting. And the easiest way to start that is to play with adjustment layers, or direct adjustments, not adjustment layers. So first is levels. And you push the midtone slider left or right according to your environment. But you'll see that you might need to make use of these limiters. So if your creature feels like it's a little too reflective or more contrasted than your background, you might want to limit your highlights a little bit. So I'm just going to do that a tiny bit. And if it feels like the shadows of your creature are darker than your background, you might want to limit your shadows just a tiny bit. That's pretty common. A really clean figurative element, the histogram looks like a hill. And that's what it should look like. Kind of a smooth hill. I do have some really dark shadows. I do have a few hot spots. But generally, it's a very balanced exposure for my creature, which is going to work well to make it match this environment. That was levels. Next, we go to color balance. This is the big, important one that I love, because the temperature of the lighting matters. The temperature is different, whether it's background, middle ground, or foreground. Mine's in the foreground, so it's fairly warm, but not quite as warm as that. So I'm going to start with the midtones, and I'm going to shift it towards the cools a little bit. And especially that cyan kind of helps. And I'm going to push it a little bit towards the greens, just a bit. And then in the highlights, I'm going to push it a little bit towards the warms and the reds, quite a bit towards the reds to help it match. And then in the shadows, usually I would push it towards the blues, but there's quite a bit of that. So I'm going to try to warm up the shadows a little bit, especially with the reds. And you can kind of tell what works just by playing with it. So this was without levels. This was after levels. This was with color balance. Okay, now hue saturation. Do you want it to be more intense or less intense? I'm just going to take the intensity down a little bit, and then you can shift its hue a little bit. What makes more sense with the color scheme of your setting. All right, and then if there's a color that's just way out there, you can always isolate it and play with that hue and that saturation separately. But I think mine are all pretty in line. So notice the highlights on the beak and on the feathers are similar to the range of the highlights on the rocks, right? So this works. All right, a good time to save it. Now what do we do? Well, we are going to look at how we can build the shadows underneath the creature, right? What are called cast shadows. And we'll do that next class. But I'm just going to take this time to now internally composite from my landscape some grass. Just going to take a little tuft of grass here. How do I internally composite? I duplicate it, Command J, and I move it up above so that I can use it as my own asset, right? And I'm going to put it between the toes, just like that. And then, how do I blend it in? I erase away from it on that bottom edge. So it looks like that grass is covering up the feet of my creature. Right? So this is not difficult. You just want to kind of think through it and think what's going to be most effective for selling the believability of your creature in this landscape. And now the big thing is going to be lighting, because we have met the angle of the anatomy to make it match. And we've tried to match the color temperature and the general levels. But the big thing that we'll learn next class is how to dodge and burn this stuff. Now, when it comes to the landscape, especially with these like little internal composites, I can burn and darken the grass so it looks like it's in the shadow that's underneath the creature, right? But if I burn the whole landscape layer, that is what's called destructive editing. Doing this over and over again. Why is it destructive editing? Well, if I animate the creature or do something else with the creature and move it, now I have a weird shadow there that doesn't make a lot of sense in the landscape on its own. So we need to find a way to make that non-destructive. So I want to go before I burned it, right? And then see. So that makes sense. That's the shadow of the tree on the grass. How can I burn it in a way that isn't destructive? And that's what we'll get into with non-destructive editing with our next video. So find your placement, crop it down, make sure you save it as its own name. And then I guess the last thing in our last minute that I can add to our folder, here's my proving ground, is we're going to do a Google image search, or we can use Pixabay. Why not Pixabay? It's a lot cleaner. And we're going to search for clouds. This is almost universally useful. We're going to be looking at photos, and we're going to be looking at non-AI clouds. We want authentic pixels only. Okay? And what you're going to do is find a big, soft texture of clouds. Maybe it's colorful. Maybe it's poofy. Maybe it has a lot of distinction to it. You're going to open that in a new tab. And there are lots, because we all know clouds are beautiful, especially here in Texas, right? And then you're going to download them. Maybe you get a couple, and then put those into your folder. These are going to be helpful for texture overlays. And I'll do one that's just the basic cloud that gets used over and over and over and over again. This one, which is why it's at the top of the search results. I'm going to move those all from my downloads into my Proving Ground 1 folder. And then between now and Wednesday, when we come back for class, you can look at that Proving Ground and look at these past examples, and you can start thinking about this, because that's going to help you make decisions about dodging and burning an atmosphere. How does your creature live in this environment? How does it breathe? How does it survive? What does it eat? All that kind of thing. To think about this, to write it down, will help you to make these connections more believable. And now that you've picked the size and placement of your creature, you have an idea, right? My creature is big enough that it needs a major food source. And that food source is near the river, so maybe it comes from the river. Maybe it eats salmon like a bear, right? That kind of thing. Or some other weird fish. So you have to start making those connections. All right, that will do it.